All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first paper session of the 50 Hours Conference, and have a great slate of really diverse presentations on American record labels. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Kevin Mungons is a Chicago-based writer and editor. He's the backlist curator for Moody Publishers and has previously worked as editorial director for nonprofit organizations. A longtime church musician, he researches and writes about gospel music, early recordings, and radio. And he and co-author Douglas Yeo have just released Homer Roadiver and the Rise of the Gospel Music Industry, published by University of Illinois Press, my alma mater. And he is now working on a companion disc for Archaeophone Records to be released this winter. Look forward to that eagerly. But for now, Kevin, please take it away, and he will be talking.
Hey, hi everybody.
Christian labels.
I'm going to try to share my screen here for just a second and see if we don't crash. We still okay with everybody?
Just fine. And I just want to remind anyone who has questions, please post those in the Q&A section on Hubelo.
All right. And I might need a little help once the Q&A comes if I don't see them, but I appreciate everybody here. I can't see you, but you can see me, so we'll get started. Here's where all of this started. The Rodeheaver book is finished. In fact, I talked to the warehouse this morning. I call every morning to see if it's arrived, and they assured me it's not there yet. Otherwise, I'd be showing you a copy. It should arrive in the warehouse any day. I appreciate all of you that have helped me with the project. Some of you know that this has been an area of interest for David Lewis for a long time, Tim Brooks. There's just a lot of people in ARSC who've been helping me through the whole thing. And Bob Marovich too, if you're here today, Bob, hi. So grateful for all of your help on the project. And UIP has given us 50% off this week. So I flashed up a little screen here that has the website address you can use and the coupon code. And by all means, use that. It's the cheapest way you'll ever get the book. Actually, at 50%, that's cheaper than my author's discount. So I don't know if they'll let me use that code or not. We'll see. When I started working on the next project, though, you know, as soon as you send a project off to the printer, you got to work on the next thing. This is kind of what happened at the tail end of Rodeheaver's life. So he starts the first gospel record label in 1920. That's followed soon after by the Vaughn record label, Southern Gospel, in spring of 1921. And his Rodeheaver's Rainbow record label was remarkably eclectic, had things that we would now today call Southern Gospel, had things we would call Black Gospel, and that had a whole bunch of other stuff that really doesn't fall into any neat description, because the thing that he really emphasized was communal singing. The congregational sing they did in revival tabernacles, 10,000 people in a wooden tabernacle being directed by Homer Rodeheaver and his trombone. That was the thing that really helped him define this whole genre of gospel music. So when we approach this, we're going to get something that's remarkably different than some of the categories we're used to. Many of us who think about this oftentimes think in terms of racial distinctions like Black gospel music, or we think in terms of regional distinctions like Southern gospel music. But interestingly, what this is like a third path, another branch of the tree that we're going to talk about today. How are we going to do it? We only have 15 minutes or 20 minutes to zoom through a really quick survey of the labels. And so I'm going to show you maybe the top 12 dozen or so. I'll give a little survey of some of the personalities involved and make some suggestions about people who are especially interesting and need more research. We'll talk a little bit about how gospel music changed during the era, and the whole idea of a Christian pop music, a commercial Christian pop music rising during this era. And then a little bit about resources, preservation issues. It's a wide open field. Here's a way to illustrate what I'm talking about. This is a magazine page from 1958, the Moody Monthly magazine. And as soon as you look at this page, you're just blown away by a fully developed industry, aren't you? Look at what you have: Christian record ads, You've got two different Christian record clubs. You've got several Christian celebrities. In the middle, you have a Christian record review. In other words, by 1958, a fully orbed genre has emerged here with its own network. And if you look in the upper left-hand corner of that Word Records ad, you see a little tagline, "Your answer to rock and roll and the influences of television, murder, and mayhem." Kind of gives you a little idea where this music was headed. Let's start right away, and I'm going to fly through way too fast some of these labels and give you an idea of what to look for, what to listen for. Before I start, I'll tell you what my experience has been. Not many people collect these. You'll find lots of people who collect Southern gospel, lots of people who collect Black gospel, and then you've got institutions who are keeping track of those things as well. What we're talking about today is usually the stuff that collectors don't know what to do with. It doesn't fit into either of their categories, so they don't know where to place it. It's the stuff that institutions sometimes save, but it's still in the back room because it hasn't been processed yet. And when we look at these labels, I want to just kind of train our eyes a little bit to see what we're looking at. And then hopefully this maybe will engender continued discussion, because that's what I'm really interested in. 1941, Bibletone Records, founded in New York by Arthur Becker, who really started out by reading passages of the scripture into his dictaphone. And after he started doing that, it turned into a thing where he shared records with his friends. And then he got some of his friends to record songs for him. And before he knew it, he had an actual business. His heart wasn't really in it. His real thing was he owned amusement parks in the Bronx. He was the guy who owned Kittyland and was not as interested in Bibletone. So eventually he sold it to Van Campen Press. It got bounced around a few times, but he does take credit for being the person who reinvigorated the whole idea of a Christian record label right at the dawn of World War II, and ended up recording about 300 sides, and it turned into something fairly significant. As a contrast to that, in 1939 in Los Angeles, an utterly fascinating label started by Joy Ritterhoff, a former missionary, single woman who came back from Central America quite ill, knew she could never return to the mission field and wanted to do something in service. So she began recording Bible readings and Bible stories, first in Spanish and then in many other different languages. But she knew nothing about the industry until she taught herself. And so she learned all of the technical aspects. She learned all of the marketing and business aspects. She learned what it was like to run her own nonprofit and basically created this label out of nothing. And it's still around today. If you were to actually surf on gospel recordings, you can find not only information about their current work, they continue to produce recordings, and they have solar powered MP3 players and all sorts of interesting technology for these developing countries. And if you look on YouTube and surf on Joy Ritterhoff's name, you'll find some really great vintage video that shows her demonstrating some of her early recordings and some of the creative devices they made to play these. Her whole idea, though, was to have a nonprofit missionary enterprise where she gave away as many of the recordings as she possibly could, funded by churches and individuals here in the US. Kind of on the other side of the coin, Sacred Records, also started in Los Angeles in 1953, is completely devised as a commercial for-profit record industry, and recorded about 400 sides during the era, was especially good at getting the work of West Coast studio musicians and TV musicians. And as Billy Graham's 1947 crusade in Los Angeles drew together many young evangelicals, they were very effectively used in Sacred Records. The rising star was Ralph Carmichael, a person we'll talk about in just a bit. But Earl Williams also, being an aggressive entrepreneur, later acquired several other labels. They never really made a go of it financially. Eventually, he sells the whole thing to Word Records in the 1960s, but gets credit for really being the grandfather of Christian record labels in California. They did many different things. Here's an example of his label that he used for children's stuff. There was another related group called Christian Recordings that shared many of the same performers and may have had some ties to what the other label was in some way. We can't quite figure that out right now. Later distributed by Pathway Records, Skylight, that's the Southern Gospel outfit in Nashville, and continued also with the White Church Records. Though it was founded in Kansas City by Deb Dyer, he was a string band and string orchestra director, radio personality who was both interested in gospel music, but also started the Red Barn record label, a sister label for country music. He got the whole thing started. He recruited lots of groups that had kind of a Southern sound, kind of a Western swing sound sometimes, homey sound, but really was not interested at all in sustaining a record label. By 1949, it's distributed by Sacred Records. Soon after that, Sacred Records actually bought the label and moved it to California. You'll see some of these that are stamped with Chicago, Illinois, but to be honest, the outfit was always in Kansas City, though some of their work might have been done in Chicago or maybe their offices. Deb Dyer was always a Kansas City guy. By this point, Homer Rodehaver has resurfaced. In 1944. He realizes that other people are starting these Christian record labels and decides that he's going to revive his own label that was really most active between 1920 and 1926. And so beginning in 1944, he starts recording some things with RCA to give away to friends. He recorded some Christmas records and other promotional things. But by 1948, he's actually doing Christmas releases. It's interesting to listen to them now. Many of them aren't very listenable, to be honest. Rodehaver's own skills had declined by this point. He was a vocalist and a trombonist. He was actually a fine baritone and a marginal trombonist, but by this point, his sense of pitch had wavered. And when you read or listen to some of these later Rainbow records, there's not many of them that are musically interesting or actually musically very sophisticated at all. By 1955, he passed away and the family let the record label go dormant. His print division, the thing that he really made money on, selling hymnals, was sold to Word Music in 1969, but the record division becomes more or less an orphan label at that point. I'm going to take a little shift and move to Chicago for a second. And by looking at some labels in Chicago, we see maybe what I would call the second group of Christian labels. The first group being out in California, Los Angeles based, really driven by Sacred Records, because by the end of the 1950s, Sacred Records is going to own most of those Los Angeles based records. Same thing's going to happen here in Chicago. Lots of different startup records happen in the 1940s. By the end of the decade of the 50s, though, they've consolidated somewhat. Alfred B. Smith was a graduate of Moody Bible Institute. Alfred B. Smith was Billy Graham's roommate at Wheaton College and Billy Graham's first song leader. And he also was a WCTS radio personality and well known in the evangelical community as a songbook publisher. By 1941, he had released his first paperback hymnals to students at Wheaton College. He was an entrepreneur who seemed to be especially good at acquiring copyrights and acquiring songs. He was a young protege of Rodehaver and was very successful right away at starting his label. The label took off because he recruited a WMBI radio soloist, George Beverly Shea, to be his first recording artist. Shea records about 12 sides for the Singspiration label before he eventually moves to a better deal at RCA. But this was enough for Al Smith to get his record label up and off the ground. Again, they recorded more than 250 sides, mostly on 78, then later released the same songs on 45 RPM. By the time that it was sold to Zondervan Music, Zondervan eventually putting out the same material on mono LPs. Smith himself eventually moved to Montrose, Pennsylvania, and continued his publishing efforts, but really didn't do anything else in the recording world after he let the record go when he moved from Chicago in 1952. Smith, like Sacred Records, was trying to make records for everyone in the family, so he had a line of children's music as well. The other big label in the Chicago area was called Singtime Records, founded in Wheaton by Robert Van Kampen. He was closely associated with Billy Graham. Billy Graham was his pastor at the village church. And then later on, Van Campen joined Billy Graham's trustee board and served with Graham's Ministries for many years. When Al Smith started his Singspiration label, Van Campen was a minority investor. And when Smith let his Singspiration label go dormant, Van Campen stepped into that vacuum and started recording things as well. He was a little more successful than Smith was at recruiting people from the Graham campaign and younger Youth for Christ artists. So his Singtime Records often have a younger flair, a more vibrant flair. And then he as well went into an acquisitions phase where he acquired some of these other labels. One of the things you note during the decades of the 1940s and 50s is how quickly these Christian labels rose and then declined. And sometimes the owners lost interest or sometimes found it wasn't financially viable. So there was a period of consolidation with the Chicago labels as well. The third trend, in addition to Los Angeles labels and Chicago labels, is what happened with custom labels. By this point, after the war, it's very easy for individual ministries to produce their own record label on their own custom label and sell it and do their own order fulfillment themselves. And so without much comment, I'm just going to zoom through here a remarkably diverse list of custom labels that you may run into when you are looking at your archives or your collections. All of these are very small labels produced by individual ministries, distributed by them, and oftentimes would only have a few dozen releases per label. I'm putting this one from the Lutheran Evangelism League up because you can also see in the runout groove the handwriting of Lois Crawford, the manager of Christian radio station KFGQ in Boone, Iowa, who clearly did not like this record because she said it was dismal. An example of custom labels can especially be seen with the Old-Fashioned Revival Hour Quartet, a very popular quartet that sang on the Mutual Radio Network for the Old-Fashioned Revival Hour many years, 1939 to 1968. They recorded for all of these mainstream labels, Christian Faith, Sacred, Singspiration. But what they found was they could do just as well with their own custom label. And so quite often you'll see a large amount of their recordings that were released by them by doing their own record label, their own custom work, their own fulfillment. They could actually be more profitable. And so they began doing that. As we transition from looking at the labels, I think I want to maybe just bring to your attention a few personalities. One of them certainly is George Beverly Shea, who had the longest career, passing away, as you know, just a few years ago, and casting an enormous influence, not just on Christian labels, but on his ability to get contracts from secular labels like RCA, and was one of the major figures. Second major figure was Ralph Carmichael, a wonderfully creative arranger and composer from Los Angeles, who you may recognize his name because in addition to being an ordained minister, he was also a very popular studio arranger and session orchestrator for Los Angeles-based groups. If you've ever picked up Stan Kenton's jazz albums, you've probably seen his name on it as Ralph Carmichael as the arranger. If you've ever picked up Nat King Cole's Christmas album and listened to chestnuts roasting on an open fire, that's Ralph Carmichael's orchestrations. He was the orchestra director for the I Love Lucy TV broadcast. At the same time, he was an ordained minister and doing lots of Christian music. So it's fascinating to see his very broad and diverse career. Mr. Carmichael is still alive, by the way, elderly, living in Los Angeles. That brings up questions of preservation that we should talk about at some point. One more stream, in addition to performers like George Beverly Shea and arrangers like Ralph Carmichael, the whole idea of radio musicians. Here's a group of students and faculty members from Moody Bible Institute in Studio A of WMBI Radio in 1939. Many of these same musicians are the ones who appear on the recordings that we are going to talk about and listen to. And that whole stream of developing Christian radio became one of the big motivators in this group of Christian radio or Christian record labels. We don't have a lot of time to listen to these, but I want to fly through just a few of them quickly, just playing little snippets so you can kind of get your ears on what some of these sound like. Some of them sound exactly like radio programs.
This is Charles E. Fuller, director of the Old Fashioned Revival Hour speaking. Rudy Atwood and George Broadbent, will you play Heavenly Sunshine for me, please?
And at the same time, some of them sound like the radio broadcasts of the era when George Beverly Shea was singing live on WMBI radio. It was just him, his voice, and the organ often sounded like this.
I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold.
At the same time that was happening, there's lots of other styles also. When you listen to the Hubbard family, that's Rex and Maud Amy Hubbard, who became evangelists and later on started the Cathedral of Tomorrow in Akron, Ohio. What you're going to hear here is a marked contrast. Sounds like Southern country western.
You have heard of little Moses in the bulrush. You have heard of Phyllis.
A little bit of the Blackwood Brothers, Give the World a Smile, their radio theme.
The world looks smiling every day. There'll be someone walking on life's way. From the paths of sin, bring the water.
And then the song that kind of blew things up, by 1948, the Homeland Harmony Quartet had recorded this song, Gospel Boogie.
Everybody's gonna be singing their story. Everybody's gonna have a wonderful time up there. Roll, hallelujah. There's a reckoning coming in the morning. Better get you ready, cause I'm giving you a warning. Everybody's gonna have a wonderful time up there.
Now, I have to say, at the time, it was considered highly controversial. But to be honest, its original title, Wonderful Time Up There, sounds like any other Southern gospel song of the era. Frankly, they sound like any other Southern gospel quartet of the era. Their big sin was not recording an up-tempo gospel song. Their sin probably was calling it a gospel boogie, because after they released it under its new title, it both became a bestseller, but also became highly controversial and drove a wedge between traditional church musicians, old school revivalists, and this new group of people that were recording music like this. Melody 4 Quartet, one more.
I thirsted in the barren land of sin and shame, and nothing sad.
And I think what I'm going to do is just end with one more, because this is probably the record that most neatly illustrates what's happening when Ralph Carmichael hires a group of studio musicians playing from real live orchestrated charts. This is what it sounds like by the end of the 1950s. In other words, it sounds like any other pop record from that era. I flipped this chart up really fast, and then we're going to fly through the rest and go to the questions, I think is what we're going to do. Here's a good way to think about early gospel. It started out as hymnals, as music printed on the page, sung by thousands of people in revival tabernacles. And then after it was a hymn book, it turned into a record like Homer Rodehaver's recording of Safe in the Arms of Jesus. By this era, the era of Christian pop, the exact opposite had happened. This music was not music that was in the hymnal. In fact, you can hear from some of those recorded examples that it would have been impossible for the congregation to sing this music. Not only that, it would have been impossible for your average church musician at a local church to play the music. And so what we had was music that was designed entirely exclusively for commercial release as performances. No longer was it communal singing in any sense. Complete transition had been made from the congregation as music makers to the congregation as an audience listening to the performers. And that's what happened by the end of this particular era. Oh, yes, there was criticism. If we had more time later, if I write about this, I'll write a little bit about the criticism. Not everybody thought it was a good idea. They called them jukebox hymns. So yes, there was a great deal of pushback during the era as well. It ended with a period of consolidation where most of these companies end up being sucked up either by word music or Zondervan music. And then quite a few of them at the dawn of the stereo era were just disappeared because they didn't survive the format changes and turned into orphan labels. You know what? I'm going to skip this screen for just a second. And I think maybe it might be prudent to stop my screen share. I'm going to leave it up here just for one more second. If you want to copy down that coupon code, I really am excited about the discount they're giving to us. I'm going to go online later on today and order Bob Marovich's latest book for 50% off. And if that's helpful for you too, that's great. I'll stop share and we'll do some questions.
Thanks, Kevin. You have one question that the curiosity about the theremin version of the old rugged cross that we saw in one of your labels.
It is exactly what it says, a theremin version of the old rugged cross. And one of the things that fascinates me about this is how crazy and eclectic some of these styles can be. I don't know why that Bible college even had a theremin or a theremin player, but apparently it was a thing. And what you hear is theremin and organ. And I wish we had more time to play it because it's nuts.
I wanted to ask you that I noticed that among your collection were not some of the sort of big Black gospel labels in Chicago. Were there sort of separate markets at this time for Black gospel records and these white Christian records?
The interesting thing about Black gospel of this era is it started out in the 1940s, mostly, oh, hang on. Hey, how's that? Mostly recording on labels that also did some blues, some jazz, and they weren't exclusively devoted to Christian recordings. Most of those early gospel artists in Black gospel, at least, became famous on record labels that were not exclusively gospel, if that makes sense. Only later did they start some gospel only record labels that are also like a whole nother fork in the road that Bob Marovich has investigated quite a bit. And there's also a great initiative down at Baylor University to collect and digitize as many of those recordings as they can find.
Yeah, so there wasn't much crossover between the two?
No, often not. There's quite a bit of crossover in the music publishing realm. For instance, Homer Rodehaver's Chicago-based hymnal company would oftentimes help with their publishing ventures and other crossover things like that. But the idea of a Black performer performing on, quote, a white label, or a white performer performing on a Black label was really not, didn't happen very frequently. Sacred Records had a couple of Black groups on it. One was called the Cleveland Colored Quartet that was quite popular with them, but those really were unusual and not the norm. This is basically a white movement.
I also was wondering about broadcast. Were any of these records used for broadcast, or was most of this performed live on radio and then the record sort of a separate thing?
It was usually performed live on radio first, and then as songs became popular and were well requested, then it would be recorded as well. Christian radio stations didn't tend to make a real crossover or change from live recordings until the early 1960s. And that's when they stopped the era of live performance. If it interests you, I'm actually at my office at Moody Bible Institute right now. I work at Moody Publishers, and just across the street is Crowell Hall with the original 1939 Moody Radio studio where Christian radio really was born. It's a big old Studio B room where they had all those live broadcasts, no longer used, but still here on campus as kind of one of the last big live radio studios.
Well, thanks, Kevin. And I just want to close by reiterating a comment from Steve Ram, who's asking you to please write an article for the ARSCA Journal on this fascinating topic. And he'd like you to make a Spotify playlist as well.
Oh, that'd be cool. It's a great idea. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much.